Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation on trends in state financial aid policy. My colleague, Dr. Pingle, and I are really excited to have you with us. And before we get started, for those of you who may not be familiar with Education Commission of the States, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who we are. At Education Commission of the States, we think of ourselves as the essential and indispensable member of any team addressing education policy. We are a trusted partner that believes in the power of learning from experience, and we know informed policymakers create better education policy. So just to continue a little bit as to Education Commission of the States and who we are and what we do. So what we do is we support policymakers and education stakeholders through our research, reporting, counseling, and convening activities. The agenda for our presentation today on trends in state financial aid has a few different components to it. First, we'll discuss national trends in state aid relevant legislation across all 50 states. And then we'll talk a little bit about tuition aid and net price to provide some context about what is being offered to students and what students are paying to meet their cost of attendance. We'll close the presentation with an overview of our principles for state financial aid redesign and allow some time at the end for Q&A. We plan to talk for roughly about 30 minutes here, and I know we have the space in this time reserved for about an hour. So do feel free to ask us any questions you may have when we get to the end of the presentation. There's plenty of time for discussion. So looking at legislative volume in all 50 states, between January 1st of 2018 and October 1st of 2018, we tracked 302 bills related to state aid. The 3 states with the most action in this space include New York, where there were 52 bills. Second after that was Maryland with 28, and New Jersey with 25. Only 11 states didn't have at least one bill during this time period. There's always a lot of interest in this space, particularly for legislators who are looking at college affordability, and especially if those legislators have institutions in their districts. So what happened to all of those 302 bills? They all ended in a different status. A lot of the time we see a lot of inaction. So about 62% of the bills that we looked at failed sine die and 14% failed. So that's about 75, a little more than 75% of that 302 total. Only 35 of those bills were enacted, and that represents about 12% of the total number that we looked at. So where did some of the activity happen with those bills that were enacted? So of the 39 states in which bills were introduced, 17 enacted one or more pieces of legislation. We noticed some interesting developments and some interesting themes that came out of the bills that we looked at. So in California, Illinois, Massachusetts, Maryland, and Oregon, legislation existed for foster youth, whether that meant waiving tuition for foster youth or programs to provide aid to foster youth. Maryland and Idaho both passed legislation related to adult learners with some prior credit accumulation. In Maryland, that looked like a program for marketing outreach and grants for this population, and in Idaho, providing aid to adults with at least 24 credits earned. Hawaii and Iowa passed legislation for free college or promise programs. California passed legislation requiring institutions to notify state aid recipients that they need to take 15 credits or the equivalent to graduate on time. Georgia authorized the establishment of a need-based aid program. However, the funding for that program has not yet been determined. And Pennsylvania authorized the use of state aid for distance education students enrolled in an institution that was headquartered in the state of Pennsylvania. Free college remains a hot legislative topic that's continued to grow throughout the years. In 2018, we reviewed 48 bills relating to free college. And in each calendar year, we see a year-by-year increase in these bills dating back to 2014 when the first bills were introduced for the Tennessee programs. And I'd just like to point out that these totals are not cumulative. This is discrete by each year. To look at free college in a slightly different context, looking at it from the 2017 to 18 session, 29 states plus Washington, D.C. had one or more bills related to free college. Two of the states with the most bill activity during this time include Hawaii and New York. And notable results from the sessions in those states include New York's Excelsior program, which first semester began in the fall of 2017, and Hawaii's Promise program, which was enacted in June of 2018. While there's a lot of interest in free college, it's important to point out that adult students may not necessarily be included in the policy and agenda for free college. While free college is on the legislative agenda, it's important to note that free college policy designs have some exclusionary elements for adult students. Free college programs that connect eligibility to recent high school graduation or other backward-looking eligibility criteria, such as high school GPA or ACT/SAT scores, may present barriers for adults. Further, the timeline for awarding of financial aid may create a barrier for adult students. Aid deadlines that occur early in the year are often used to strike a balance between limited funds and oversubscription. That meaning when there are too many eligible students competing for limited funds. And this practice can be exclusionary for adult students whose plans for attendance may not have solidified earlier in the year and may be looking to apply for financial aid closer to the fall enrollment deadline. The role of adult students in states' attainment agendas is important. We conducted an analysis using the Lumina Foundation's goal of 60% attainment by 2025 and assuming a high school graduation rate of 100%, where 100% of those graduates directly matriculated to college. What we found is that more than half of the states will fall short of their attainment goals, relying on high school graduates alone. Adult students completing post-secondary degrees are key in reaching attainment goals. We also analyzed 100 of the largest state aid programs, defining largest as total number of dollars dispersed, and found that some of their criteria may not support adult students. 48 of those programs are merit-based, 30 require full-time enrollment, 26 link eligibility to high school graduation date, and 19 excluded two-year institutions. So what are some of the options that states have to support adult students with financial aid? They can choose to base awards on need and not merit. They can support part-time enrollment. They can remove linkages of eligibility to high school graduation date. They can publish state financial aid deadlines after August 1st, which have more potential to reach students over the age of 25, or those students whose plans for the fall may not have been solidified, and include two-year community colleges and technical colleges.
Great, thanks, Carol. So that covers the first part of our agenda where we wanted to look at legislative trends, free college, and adult students. In the second half of the presentation, we're going to look at some work that we're kind of emerging work we're doing around comparing affordability across the states and cover our 4 principles of aid redesign and allow some time for Q&A. I'm Sarah Pingle, as Carol said at the start. I'm so sorry that I missed you all at the annual conference. I wanted so badly to be there. But I'm also glad that we have this opportunity to engage in a different platform to get some of this content into your inboxes and into your back pocket as you move into the new legislative session. Just kind of like some things off the top that we probably should have mentioned. We are recording this, so we will post this online so that everybody can see it. And you can use the chat feature to ask your questions. You can send them through now, but I'll admit Carol and I are probably not going to look at them until after we're done with the presentation part. I just feel like air traffic controller and pilot at the same time here, so bear with us a little bit. So when you think about affordability, I know you guys have probably noticed as well in your roles, there's really been a lot of conversation around defining what affordability means. What can we do to compare states in a fair way across borders on this affordability metric, whatever it is? And as Carol and I have been tossing around, there's kind of some major components of this conversation that we think need to be captured. So there's the total cost of attendance. How much does it actually cost to attend college successfully? Buy your books, have a food on your table, a place to live, transportation, all of those components of the total cost of attendance. Of that, there's the portion that's tuition, which lawmakers are usually primarily considered with what does that rate of tuition look like? How far do our aid programs go in covering that? Is our tuition at a level where we want it to be, especially relative to other states? There's a financial aid component to considering affordability, both the federal programs and state programs and institutional aid. And then all that kind of comes out in this net price number, which I know a lot of the folks on this webinar are familiar with what that means, right? So that's what students, it's essentially the student contribution, right? So what the student and or family would be expected to pay after the application of financial aid and things like that. So these are kind of the four concepts that we're trying to capture in some of these different ideas about affordability that we've been tossing around. So this is one of the first ways that we've looked at it. And I know other groups have done similar charts to this before, but we're trying to get to a place where we can look at states relative to one another. So what this chart represents is along the, I'm pointing, none of you can see me, horizontal or the x-axis, you can see we have tuition plotted out there. So all the way over on the left would be a tuition of zero, and then over to the right, a tuition of about $15,000 a year. So some of the states with lower tuition on here would be a Wyoming or a Florida, higher tuition, Vermont, New Hampshire. On the up and down, or the y-axis, we've got state aid per full-time enrolled student. So on the bottom, we would have states with lower relative amounts of aid per student, Alabama, Hawaii, Arizona, those kinds of groups down there. And up at the top, we would have states that have higher amounts of aid per FTE, New Jersey, South Carolina, Tennessee. And what this does is essentially puts the states on quadrants of high tuition, high aid, high tuition, low aid, low tuition, high aid, and low tuition, low aid, relative to the US average. So in the center of this chart, we've got the US average for tuition and required fees and your average state aid per full-time enrolled student. So this is just relative to what the average looks like. Where does my state fall in terms of the aid that's awarded and the tuition that's charged? We think that this is a fair way in some respects to look at, how states compare to one another on this one. I'm really interested in hearing from you all, how you feel about this kind of representation of your state. Do you feel that this is a good or a bad way to look at states across? I know when we've presented this in legislative venues, I think legislators in particular are really interested in that low tuition, low aid quadrant, right? So are we not charging a bunch, and then are we not spending a lot on subsidizing the tuitions in that? For individual students? I think that's a place where a lot of legislators have been interested in lately, but I think that there's also merit to being in a lot of the other quadrants on this chart too, right? So there are ways that we can make sure that institutions are well resourced through tuition revenue, but maybe not too much tuition revenue. The whole thing is a balancing act. So in the comments or in the Q&A, we're certainly open to feedback. We haven't publicly released this chart at all at this time. So we're certainly open to feedback on reactions to this and where you think things should fall. The other way that we've been looking at measuring affordability is by looking at net price, and specifically net price by income. So when we convened, many of you on this webinar are familiar with some of ECS's work around state financial aid redesign. And when we've convened thought leaders around this idea of goal-driven and data-informed financial aid, they've really pushed us to think of a metric that we could look at all the states across fairly. And in the last iteration of this group, looking at net price by income was a metric that a lot of folks were really interested in pushing on. So this is just the national data. So what this shows essentially is, in the purple lines, we see the public 2-year institutions, the orange 4-year institutions. And for some of the lowest income students in the country, even to attend a 2-year institution, they're facing a net price. So that's after their aid is applied, a cost of $5,990 to be able to attend a 2-year institution for a year, and about $9,360. When you move up to the higher income groups, those numbers really don't rise a ton, which I thought was pretty remarkable when Carol and I started to examine this data. So if you make between $0 and $30,000 a year, you're about $6,000 for a 2-year institution, and that doubles where that person's income actually more than tripled. We're expecting about double the investment, but the income goes up by so much more. So that's one of the angles that we've been thinking of as we look at this information. If you're interested in looking at what your specific state looks like, I'll encourage you to head to our blog at ecs.org. Carol has put together a map of all of the 50 states. You can toggle between the 2-year and 4-year sectors, and then hover over your state to see what those net prices by income look like. We've got all the states and Puerto Rico represented on there. And just take a look. Your median household income for your state will be listed there, as well as those net prices by income. And we pull those from iPads and from the census from the American Community Survey for those incomes. Again, we're really open to your feedback on this. This is publicly facing right now. This is on our blog. Carol published this blog earlier this week. And we're really interested in hearing what you all have to think about this particular measure as one that could indicate, affordability of a college education in your state. Finally, I just wanted to conclude, Carol shared a lot of our legislative tracking. It seems that we have no shortage of ideas in this space, but many of these ideas never really see their day in committee or see their day on the floor to be voted on. And then we presented some complicating information about how to measure affordability, but we like to leave folks with a little bit of like, okay, what do we do about this, right? And so ECS has advanced these 4 principles of state financial aid redesign. These have really been my babies over the last 4 years and supporting states and thinking through their state aid programs. I'm going to go over them quickly because I know that many of you have heard these before, and you can also get way more about each of them in our report, Redesigning State Financial Aid Principles to Guide State Aid Policymaking. The first principle of state financial aid design that we advance is that aid programs should be student-centered. They should really be designed around students and their needs in order to set them up for successful outcomes. What this means is in a lot of states, we've applied this as being a focus on need-based aid. So if the students you're trying to reach are those that are low income that may be ready for college but may not be able to afford it, considering a need-based approach could be a student-centered approach to aid in your particular state. For the second principle, goal-driven and data-informed, we encourage states to think of financial aid programs that have a clearly defined, easily understood intent that's aligned with some measurable goals. So all too often in the education finance space, we see finance conversations take place before a real strategic goal is ever set for what we're all trying to achieve, and before folks are really in agreement on that goal. So one person's goal may not be another person's goal, and then we come to the table and try to align the financial resources, but that conversation becomes difficult because we don't have agreement on what we're trying to do. So we're really encouraging states to really spend time setting those strategic goals that have wide buy-in, and then align the financial resources behind them. Set up those data systems. I know this sounds so much easier when I say it like this as opposed to in practice. I mean, you guys know this more than anybody. Set up those data systems so that we can measure along the way. Is progress being made? Do we need to make mid-course corrections? Are we actually achieving what we set out to achieve? So this is the second principle of aid redesign, and this is also really where a lot of our defining affordability work is kind of originated, is in conversations around what does goal-driven and data-informed aid look like. Our third principle is timely and flexible. We really believe that financial aid programs should provide support to students when it can actually have an impact on their enrollment decision or their decision to persist and remain enrolled. Calendars can be really problematic for a lot of reasons when it comes to, if you're looking from a student perspective, when am I going to enroll? When do I know that I need to be back in school to retrain? That calendar looks different for a lot of students. And then when you layer on a legislative calendar in terms of when a budget will be approved, when money will be available to award, and then layer on your agency calendars as well. So when can we award? When do we know that funds will be exhausted? Things can get really complicated really fast. We use this principle to really focus back on the student perspective to say, if we're thinking about reaching some of those, especially adult students that Carol alluded to earlier, they're not necessarily going to know in January that they're going to get laid off in June and need to retrain in August. And then in the meanwhile, they've missed the aid deadline that happened in March. So we're trying to push states to think through ways to use calendar to their advantage to actually change students' minds, and then also to promote that flexibility so that aid is available at different points in the calendar year. Again, another easier said than done. The fourth principle is broadly inclusive. We know that students are making progress towards credentials in a really broad variety of ways today. But the aid can't always respond to all those diverse enrollment options. So whether it's a fee to take a CLEP exam or put together a prior learning assessment portfolio and have it reviewed, we believe that financial aid programs should support credit accumulation and support students in getting to the podium no matter how those credits are accumulated. So we're encouraging flexibility on that front in terms of how students accumulate their credits and how aid can support students in doing that. Coming to the end here, I just wanted to encourage everybody that, you know, you can bring this work to your state if getting some of this high level view on what the legislative tracking looks like, kicking around some ideas around defining affordability or digging really deeply into the 4 principles of aid redesign is something that you think will resonate with your state or with stakeholders in your state. Carol and I will travel. We do this all the time, and we have done this for many of you that are registered on the webinar today. We provide unbiased advice on policy plans. So if you have an idea that you're kicking around either within your office or with a legislative partner or someone in the executive branch, we're happy to help be that third party to provide advice on those plans. Sometimes that looks like marking up draft legislation. That's something that we do a lot. Sometimes that looks like just being on a conference call to talk about ideas. We review and consult on proposed policy on a regular basis. So we can review those bill drafts. We can go back and compare to other states what they're doing to try to help to normalize the struggle that you have a little bit, and also to help you find some state peers that might have some lessons learned that they can share with you. We also testify at legislative hearings as third-party experts. Many of you on this webinar and in different states have used us in this capacity. Even if it's, you know, something that you from an agency perspective can easily present on and say yourself, sometimes it is just really helpful to have a third party come in and reiterate some of those same messages and share what some of the trends look like from our perspective. So we are happy and willing to come and provide legislative testimony as it would be helpful to you all. And with that, we will transition over to the Q&A. I will say again that I am both air traffic controller and pilot, so please do bear with me if I miss your question. We will have them all recorded in here so I can follow up with folks, hopefully. But we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can today. So let me see what we've got. Frank, yes, we will make the presentation slides available to you, especially that tuition and aid quadrant slide. Yes, if you were on a small screen today too, I'm sorry that it's hard to read what the little states are in there. So we will make sure that that's available to the membership. So that is good. So those were those 2 questions. Let's see what we might have through the chat feature really quickly. How do I get back to that? Alrighty. We love the net price data. Good. I'm glad that that's resonating. We've heard that from a few different folks that, you know, it's amazing what's publicly available out there, and it's just having someone to crunch it together can help to paint a new story. So thank you for that, Brenda. That was definitely a labor of was it love, Carol? I don't know.
There was some love in there, for sure.
All right. The graph with tuition and fees and aid on the Y using all, okay. So we may have some data, complicating data factors for some of your states in there. So we use all aid from the NASGAP survey, all of the grants and scholarships that were awarded. Yes, so the sector specific question is a problem in the tuition and aid slide. We can get at what the sector specific tuition numbers in the data sources that we have available. We can't get sector specific aid data. So when you all fill out your NASGAP survey, there are questions in there about how much went to students in the 2-year sector and the 4-year sector, private, public, all of that. That currently is not enough. States don't or can't provide that at this time for Carol and I to be able to have sector specific quadrant charts created. And I know that for many of you, you can't report that out, especially if you have really decentralized programs, you may not know what's going on there. So Elizabeth, that is a point very well taken. That is a downside to the data availability that we have. If you know of a better way that we can get some sector specific information and create different quadrant charts that are specific to each sector, we would be all ears on that one, because I think that that would be a better way to look at it for sure, but it's just an unfortunate data limitation. And those are all of the questions that we have. So you all may have some time back in your day today. If you're having trouble submitting a question or anything like that, I think you can use the chat feature and we'll see them that way. And we'll leave it open for another couple of minutes. But if that's all the questions that we have, then we were just that thorough, I guess, Carol. All right. Well, with that, I guess we will end the webinar. I'll end the recording. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's always a pleasure to get to talk to the folks that are really on the ground and implementing these programs. We will put the recording up as well as links to the quadrant chart that we presented in the slides. I will get with Elizabeth to get an email out over the listserv to all of you on that. And you've also got our contact information shared here. If you have any other questions that you want to ask offline, Carol and I are certainly more than happy to take your calls and emails and work through those issues with you. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.